Good evening, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita. This is Swami Kriyananda's commentary on the teachings, based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Let us start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri, Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow at thy feet. Bless us with wisdom, insight, soul understanding, that the words of this classic scripture and the wisdom of Master and Swamiji will come into our hearts and minds and transform us into deeper devotees, clearer, more loving, more courageously and completely dedicated to following the path of self-realization. Om Peace. Amen. All right, my friends, we are still in the chapter of the book called Freedom Through Action, which happens to be chapter 15 of the book, but we're only on chapter 3 of the Gita, and it says, chapter 3, stanza 24, if I were to cease being active in cosmic creation, the universe itself would cease to exist. Confusion would result, and mankind would be brought to ruin. Now the voice, the I speaking here is Krishna speaking as the infinite spirit. And the purpose of this stanza is to remind us that everything in creation is happening by the will of God. There's this strange delusion, and that delusion is created by Maya. Maya is a very much more subtle concept in the Indian philosophy than mere Satan is. Satan is kind of this, the phrase I was going to use is this devilish fellow who goes around tricking people. But you sort of have him as this personified evil guy who's trying to entice us into bad behavior, which is annoying, there's no doubt about it. And it provides us a convenient excuse, excuse which I often use, not as seriously as perhaps some people might use it, but the devil made me do it. I find is very useful when, for a reason beyond one's comprehension, one makes a silly action or a stupid mistake or worse. But the concept of Maya is much more subtle because Maya is the sorcerer, the magician, the caster of spells. So what really happens to us is much more than just we're enticed to bad behavior. What happens to us is we look at this world and we make explanations for it, and we start down this pathway of belief that is just a trick. It's just like it's been spun in a certain way. So this Gita verse is very, very simple. If I were to cease being active, if I, the divine spirit, were cease to be active in cosmic creation, the universe itself would cease to exist. There are so many mysteries to this world, and we just walk right past them. And then we make all these egoic decisions about how things are really run. And then we start sort of down that road, and maybe even for multiple incarnations, we can just keep going down that road where, I decide what I want, and I put out the energy in the way that I want it, and then I get what I want, which we sometimes do. Even now, this is being recorded just at the very end of June in the year 2020. And this is, we're however many months we are into the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, in which for most people on the planet, and certainly for those of us who live in California where I am, life has just been shifted over. I mean, even within the closeness of the Ananda community that I live, we have small family pods within it. There's a family pod that works within the house that I live in for all of the, now that it's a recording studio, we live as a sequestered family pod in multiple dwellings, but nonetheless all following very strict protocols. But once you step outside the door of this house, even into the community, we're all masked, and we're all following these protocols of keeping each other from getting ill. And by the grace of God, Ananda, even globally, has been almost entirely spared. Not entirely, but very close to it, considering how many we are and how varied we are. But this whole just complete shift, this thing that happened, it's like these are not actions that are controlled by men or women, by human ego. We're just in this maelstrom of divine energy, of correcting huge misunderstandings that have been building on the planet for a very long time, of just living in ways that are not compatible with divine law. And we don't seem to know it. We just don't seem to know that it's not human beings that run the planet, it's we as part of a greater reality who need to cooperate with the divine power, which is really the power behind all of creation. So in this verse, Krishna says so casually, if I even stopped for a moment, if the divine ray were withdrawn, all the life force would be withdrawn from everything and it would entirely cease to exist. Confusion would result and mankind would be brought to ruin. My. There is an actual, traditional understanding of the dissolution of all of creation, the day and night of Brahma, where the creation is manifested for an incalculably long time for the human mind to grasp, which is the day of Brahma, and then it's withdrawn for another incalculably long time, which is called the night of Brahma. No one, no prophet, no sage, no saint, seems to think that we're on the edge of that kind of a dissolution. But for many, many long period of time, since Master's lifetime, which is now, 100 years ago since he came to America, he's been predicting that the world would be shifted, first painfully shifted away from its wrong understanding, and then joyfully regenerated according to a new understanding, which is more in harmony with the divine, because we are in an ascending yuga, things that we'll talk about in just a moment. In the commentary, here Krishna is speaking of partial dissolution, meaning he's not talking about the final day and night of Brahma. He's emphasizing the need for God's presence in man's life and the ruin that would result without divine inspiration. And then he explains the commentary. Partial dissolution is a diminished manifestation of God's conscious manifestation with waxing chaos and the gradual ruin of mankind. Let me see what I was wanting to say. God's partial withdrawal from outward manifestation signifies a weakening of that magnetic power which draws people upward toward enlightenment. Were there no such upward attraction, human nature itself would have little or nothing to lift it. Mankind needs divine grace. Without it, he might never turn to goodness, except perhaps temporarily under the influence of suffering. This is really the crux of the matter. And it's just so interesting in life. I was reflecting on this a little bit more. I and many of the people who live at Ananda have been truth seekers from a very young age. Not all of us. Some people lived happily until whenever it happened that suffering struck in one form or another, and it was necessary then to get more serious about life. Others of us, because of spiritual effort in past lives that ended, however it particularly ended, I'm not raising one above the other, it just depends on karma. Just come into this world wanting to see what's behind the illusion. I vividly remember being 10 years old, having a very strong feeling that the world that I was looking at through the picture window of my parents' house, on Hillcrest Drive in El Paso, Texas, just standing there looking out the window. And I remember looking at the neighbor's house. For some reason I was looking at the house not across the street, but a little to the left. And there was this man. For some reason I think his name was Walter, but I have no idea why. He was mowing his lawn, as suburban people do. And I just remember staring out that window with this incredible intensity, thinking that if I just stared hard enough at that man mowing his lawn, then suddenly the illusion would dissolve and I would actually see what I dimly sensed was the truth behind it. Of course, my mental, spiritual force was not strong enough to break through. But you know how childhood is. I'm 73 years old now. This was like 63 years ago. But there was something very real in it because time is incidental when we're dealing with superconscious realities. But here what Swami talks about is there is this magnetic power which is actually more powerful than the satanic force which is drawing us the other way. There's this spiritual power which is always beckoning us to a state which the best way to call it is a state of greater awareness. You know, the whole spiritual path can also be defined as a gradual increasing in awareness. Because the reason that we don't know that God is in charge is not because God is not in charge. It's because we're not aware that God is in charge. The reason we think that the human ego can run everything and I can make all the decisions I want and it's going to come out my way is because we're not aware of these higher forces. And over the course of many lifetimes, we try out all these different ways of compelling creation and the universe to match my ideal of what it's supposed to be. And if we have enough willpower and enough intuitive skill, which we gradually develop, to be able to draw the forces of the universe and bend them in our will, to our will, we can have some pretty successful times. We can learn how to play the game and have lifetimes in which we do have the illusion that we are really in charge. But in the midst of all of this, there is another conscious force, and that's our own superconscious self, God, Guru, Divine Mother. What you call it, it really doesn't make any difference. But there's a force that's always pulling us toward greater awareness. I mean, that's what happens. It's very vivid when we're children, because children are always wanting to explore, always wanting to understand, always wanting to figure out sort of what's going on in this world. I remember this wonderful little boy, this wonderful incident with this little boy that I knew. He was the youngest child of friends of mine. And his mother ran a very orderly house, and he was just beginning to make sense out of the world around him. He could talk, but not a lot. And I remember I came to visit them, and he had this discovery that he really wanted to share with me because it was such a powerful discovery for him. And he took me up to his room, and he had this bureau where his clothes were kept. And he pulled out the bottom drawer, and stacked in there very neatly were his socks. And of course, you look at it, it's just a plain cabinet, but when you open it, you look in and you see the socks. He pulls open the drawer, and he practically screams at me, "Socks!" like this. And I'm trying to figure out what is going on here. And then he pushes the drawer closed again. They disappear, of course. And then he looks like, "You are not going to believe what's going to happen next." And then he opens the drawer again, points again, and screams, "Socks!" like that. I think he did it 3 times before he was convinced that I understood. He had discovered order in the universe, that every time he opened that drawer, there would be socks in there. I mean, that's the beginning of self-realization in a real sense. You figure out that there's divine laws that you can follow, that there's something you can rely on. Of course, him relying on his socks being in that drawer doesn't rise to the level of God realization by any means, but it's trying to understand. And there's this constant pull. And that's why children play so much and have so much fun. And that's why play is so important to them, because they're finding out. They're driven to find out, to experience, to feel, to taste, to touch, to test, and find out what's true. And then if they're gifted, if they're blessed, then that continues all through our lives, that we are always eager to keep learning and to keep knowing. And that is the divine force. And without that you can't even contemplate what life would be. Were there no such upward attraction, human nature itself would have little to uplift it. We would just go in circles. But something inside of us, it's that divine part inside of us that knows. I've often thought of it this way. If we didn't know that we were destined for eternal bliss, we wouldn't ever be unhappy. It's because when we're unhappy, some part of us knows that there's something wrong. If we were destined to, if there was no potential for bliss, then whatever is would be sufficient, because you wouldn't even know that there was an alternative to it. But the soul always knows there's an alternative. And so when we're sad, when we're miserable, when we're disappointed, when we're heartbroken, something inside of us rebels against that. And that is not our own ego self. That is the presence of the divine. This is what the commentary is saying. Without God, and this is where Krishna says, if I were to cease being active, confusion would result and mankind would be brought to ruin. If there was no divine force calling us back home to him, society would have no direction at all, and mankind would be brought to ruin. He also mentions, without that inward call of the divine, man would never turn that way, except temporarily through suffering. And that is the other interesting part of it. We get serious when we get miserable. And as soon as we're not miserable anymore, we forget all our resolutions. There's a silly story, let's see, how would it go? There's millions of variations on it, but it's the man lost in the desert and praying to God to be rescued, and then all of a sudden a jeep comes driving up, and the man cancels the prayer. Oh, don't need your help anymore, God, a jeep has arrived. There's lots of variations on it, but it's all just the prayer, and then there's a human intervention, and then there's the belief that the human being has saved you rather than the belief that God has saved you. When we suffer and we can't see a way out, we're inclined to think about God, but as soon as comfort returns, we forget. Master tells that story in Autobiography of a Yogi, where one of Master's friends named Sashi, he introduced him to Sri Yukteswar, and Sri Yukteswar wanted him to he predicted that Sashi would suffer serious health problems, wanted him to wear sapphire, and Sashi wouldn't do it. Eventually, the whole story plays itself out, and Sashi becomes quite sick, and he's saved by Sri Yukteswar's intervention. But Master remarks that oddly afterwards, instead of devoting himself to Sri Yukteswar in gratitude, Sashi never came back. He was temporarily, he threw himself at the feet of the Guru, but once health was restored, he didn't think about it anymore. So we need to become also much deeper in our spiritual commitment. So it isn't just a question of alleviating momentary suffering when nothing else seems to be working. I'll turn to God. What we need to tune into is that part of ourselves which is constantly longing for greater awareness. Now, none of this can be done by, what do I want to say, by affirmation. You can't dictate, you can't you can't bully yourself into it. But we can constantly use every technique we have to keep in front of us our relationship with this inward pull of Divine Mother. It's funny, sort of what I'm actually thinking is, It's the grace of God to feel the grace of God. And it's the grace of God that allows us to love God. So what we really have to pray for, we have to pray to Divine Mother to watch over us and to constantly remind us and to realize that the ability to love God is the grace of God. And even that is not my doing. It's not like with my ego self, I determine that I will become this great devotee. It's by surrendering all of that so-called power that we think we have. And the more we just understand that we're just children of Divine Mother and we live by her mercy. This is what this verse is also trying to tell us. Everything ultimately is the grace of God. That's why saints get so simple. They just begin to feel so simple about everything, because the more you immerse yourself in the divine flow, the more all our little human efforts reveal themselves to be as nothing compared to that river of grace. I won't try to reconcile it more than that, but the bhakti way, the devotee's heart, eventually we all come to that. We come to that because we simply perceive it that way. At the end of Swamiji's life, it was so, in the last years of Swami's life, it was so interesting. He just became softer and softer and more childlike. And his mind was just as brilliant as it had ever been in the last years of his life. He wrote many books, including this one, his commentary on Patanjali. He wrote brilliant and beautiful books. But most of the time, whenever he spoke, no matter what he would start out talking about, he would end up talking to us about reading Autobiography of a Yogi, crossing the country on the bus, going in to see Master, having Master bless him, becoming a disciple. It's like everything else that had happened in Swami's 60-some years of discipleship, and all that he had done for Master, all that he had accomplished, all that Master had accomplished through him. Let me say it the way Swami would say it. And the adulation and the recognition and just everything. None of it made any difference to him. All he would talk about was meeting Master, being graced to be his disciple. He was, in a very real sense, he was explaining to us where all of it had come from. And all of that manifestation had just had its origin point, had a very simple origin point. When he first met Master, Master accepted him as a disciple and gave him his unconditional love. And everything else was just incidental to that. I remember being with Swamiji about 2004, when he had just moved to India, 2005, right in there. He moved to India at the end of 2003 to establish a work for Ananda there, which he did very successfully. And there was a mall relatively near where his house was. And sometimes we would go over there, and there was a nice little coffee shop. It was an indoor mall. There was a nice coffee shop that served really excellent Italian coffee, and we'd just sit there. It was just an outing, a place to be out. And there was a bookstore nearby, and Swami always loved to go into bookstores and browse the books. And we were browsing the spiritual section, and there was a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi there. And Swami was just looking at something else, and a man just walked up and pulled out Autobiography of a Yogi and was looking at the cover and sort of looking at it. And I happened to be with Swamiji. And usually when Swami went out to that mall, he wore his orange robe. But for some reason, I think he was dressed in Western clothes that day. But he just turned to this man. I say that because the man's reaction, I think, was governed by the fact that Swami was a Westerner in Western clothes. He said to the man, "I was his disciple," just like that. He said, "He was the greatest man that I have ever known. I've been his disciple for more than 60 years. And Swami was just like a little boy, just like a child in his enthusiasm. This man had picked up Autobiography of a Yogi. Swami said, "I read that book." And in 1948, however many years ago that was, I read that book. It completely changed my life. The man looked a little uncomfortable. by Swamiji's enthusiasm, which is why I think he wasn't in his orange robe, because otherwise he would have taken him more seriously, and just kind of put the book back on the shelf. But I thought to myself, Swami just couldn't contain his enthusiasm. He wasn't trying to do anything. He wasn't trying to convert the man. It was the man had Autobiography of a Yogi in his hand, and Swami wanted him to know what the divine potential of that book could be for him. I was deeply touched by it. And I thought to myself, I need to be able to say that to myself really often. I am his disciple. My life was changed. I often, actually now, a phrase that I often use with myself, I am the disciple of a great master. I was privileged to know Swami Kriyananda for 45 years, 50 years. It's just like everything else in life is quite small by comparison, because it's the divine power calling us to enlightenment. That's the real force. That's the real force in all of creation. There's one drama going on, which is the jiva, the individual spark of divinity, is wandering around, hypnotized by Maya, imagining that it's separate and vulnerable, and simultaneously the Om vibration is resonating on another level of our consciousness, just calling us back. I remembered recently a very interesting experience I had in my very early years of Ananda. I was raised in a Jewish family in a Christian country, America, and so I'd never celebrated Christmas. We weren't really particularly observant as Jews, but we were Jewish enough not to have Christmas. So the first year that I was at Ananda, 1971, when it came around to December, Swamiji also, that year he really started the 3-day Christmas celebration, which had been Master's way, and then Swami adopted it, and Ananda's followed it ever since. 2 days before Christmas, on, let's say, the 25th, the 23rd, we had an 8-hour meditation. On Christmas Eve, well, Swami would actually have a number of us over for breakfast, for brunch at his house. But then in the evening there would be a Christmas party. And then on Christmas Day, those first years we would gather in the temple and we would listen to Handel's Messiah, because Swami hadn't yet written his own oratorio. And then we would have a banquet, Indian food, because that's what Master did. And afterwards Swami would address the community. The Christmas, I called it the State of the Union address Swami would give us. It was the state of the union of our souls with the divine. It was the annual yoga address, not street address, but discourse. And so we started it that year. And he had to teach me how, nobody knew anything about Indian food. There was one Indian man, but he wasn't there. So Swami had to teach me all about how to make Indian food, and he trained me. Excuse me. I learned to make rasagula and various other things. But the Christmas Eve party was in what was the common dome, which is what we called it. It was the dining room dome. There are very old pictures of it. There was built-in tables and built-in platform where we would sit at the tables. And the whole community was 40 or 50 people, or the ones who would attend Swami events. So when that Christmas Eve came, I'd made eggnog according to a special recipe Swami had. And the eggnog, I think Swami read us a P.G. Woodhouse story. And then this woman named Kalyani, who was a very gifted pianist, we put the foot pedals onto the harmonium so it was like an organ. She played it with the foot pedals, and then she would play it with 2 hands, even though the keyboard was short. And then they put up music, and Kalyani was trained, and she could sing beautifully, and Swami sang with her, and they sang some just beautiful sacred music, and then everybody sang Christmas carols, and I'd never been anywhere where people had that kind of devotion to God. And I knew this was my first experience of the presence of Jesus, and well, it was heavenly. I just can't even say. I was transported to an astral universe, vividly remembered it for years. 6 or 7 years after that Christmas Eve, which just still, as you can hear when I say it, is vivid in my consciousness, I had another picture in my mind that came to me. Because one thing about my visual memory of Christmas Eve was why I saw it from the other side of the room, because it was my inclination to get right in the middle of everything. But my visual memory of that evening, the Christmas singing especially, is that I was on the other side of the room. And then about 6 or 7 years later, I remembered why. Because I was in a state of extreme emotional turmoil, because many things that had been very precious to me had all been ripped away by moving to Ananda. I had just lost a lot of things that I was deeply attached to. And that Christmas, the emotion of that Christmas had also brought up all of these upset feelings. And I was young and I cried a lot and I cried easily. And I was crying through a great deal of that Christmas party. And so I was huddled in this sort of dark corner half behind the heater with a big wad of paper towels in my hand so that I could just cry and cry and cry. It was very real. I mean, that was not a joke. There was no even-minded and cheerful. I was a mess. But I forgot it. I mean, like, I totally forgot it, because the soul and the emotions are two different realities. My soul was home. My soul was being called by that upward moving force. I was on my way to God, and I knew it. And I was, after my life of seeking, which was only 24 years at that point, but after feeling so bereft in this world without any idea what was going to happen, and having heard that call and responded to it, I was in ecstasy. The fact that I was crouched in a corner weeping just meant nothing. It meant nothing in the context, because those are just the waves on the surface. It's this ocean of spirit. It's this call from God, and that's the end of everything. I mean, that's the resolution of all confusion and difficulty, is that suddenly we hear that voice. And that's why the more advanced saints get, the more simple they get about Jesus or Guru or Master or Divine Mother, however they feel it. Because everything else is so small compared to that connection and where it's going to take us. So let's now read chapter 3, verse 25. O descendant of Bharata, which is, there's many different names for Arjuna, as foolish people out of attachment to ego act in hope of rewards, so should the wise also, even if wisdom has lifted them out of any personal need to be active, act with dispassion and non-attachment, glad to be of service to others as their guides on the path to enlightenment. So what he's saying here is, of course, even if there's no personal drive for action, the man of wisdom shows others how best to live in this world. Never should the wise, this is verse 26, chapter 3, never should the wise condemn the ignorant for the ego motivation they manifest. Instead, being themselves enlightened, they should seek only to inspire others in the direction of preferring to perform right, dutiful action. It's a very interesting point. You know, what it is on the spiritual path. I remember somebody asking Swamiji, how much discipline is enough discipline? It's a very important question, especially for people who have a lot of willpower and can just drive themselves in one direction or another. Swami's answer was, you should discipline yourself as much as you can do with joy. Now it's a very interesting answer, but what we also have to understand is that with joy is not the same as with ease and pleasure. Joy is a very different word than ease and pleasure. And joy is also a very different word than happiness, because a person can be engaged in something which is extremely arduous, maybe even a little frightening, and very challenging to do. So the ease and pleasure isn't really there. And even we might not even be that happy while we're doing it. But on a deeper level, we understand why we are doing it, and the knowledge of why we are doing it turns whatever strain there might be into an attitude of freedom and joy. When Swami Kriyananda moved to India, as I mentioned, in 2003, he almost immediately started having, well, his health was not good. He was 77 years old already when he moved. He immediately started having one adventure after another of physical difficulties. So much so at that time there was a small private hospital not too far from the house where they lived. And he became, that small hospital became like a favorite hotel. I mean, all the doctors, all the nurses knew Swamiji, and he would check in and out of that hotel, that hospital, fairly often. Partly they did that because Miriam, who was the nurse, the full-time nurse, she was a devotee and she happened to be a highly skilled nurse. And for the last years of Swami's life, wherever he was, she was there. He rarely was anywhere without her being right nearby. She knew that the only way to get Swami to rest, to stop working, to stop driving himself, was to put him in the hospital. And sometimes he just literally needed to lie down and put his feet up to give his heart a little, to ease the strain on his heart. So Swami would just sort of check in and out of that hospital for a few days here and a few days there, and there was a whole routine of him going in, and the staff there let Swami's staff members sometimes stay overnight in his room. In fact, always stay overnight in his room, and his cook would bring him meals. Indian hospitals in general actually recognize that the presence and the care of the family often is the key to the patient getting well. Rather than isolating them from those that love them, they allow, and they're set up to allow those who love them to be near. So in one of those stays in the hospital, I happened to be there, and I was sitting in Swami's room with him, and a Swami from somewhere else, someone I'd never seen before and never saw again. The Swamis in India find each other. They're a relatively small population, and the fact that Swami had moved to India, the word was going around, and many sadhus and saints, and not saints because there weren't that many, but many truth seekers would just come to visit him just for his darshan. So this sadhu came into the hospital and was talking with Swami, and it was very sweet. He expressed concern for him, that he was sorry to see that Swami was unwell, because he'd heard that he'd been in and out of the hospital with pneumonia and congestive heart failure, and eventually he broke a rib, and lots of different things happened. But when the sadhu said to Swami, "I'm so sorry for all that you're suffering here," Swami laughed in the most cheerful manner and just said, he said, "I'm just doing tapasya for the work, to establish this work in India." Now, tapasya generally means austerity, some kind of the word even penance could be put in, some kind of a deliberately undertaken deprivation of the obvious in order to gather energy. Sometimes when the hero has to go off on his great quest, first he goes and does penance because it gathers energy, and then you have that energy to direct. It's discipline in order to magnetize energy so to have more energy for what you're trying to achieve. Tapasya, interestingly, can also be translated as devotion, because one does it out of devotion for a higher cause. So Swami just said, it doesn't matter, I'm just doing tapasya for the work in India. And Swamiji, especially in his last years, but all through his life, he used his body. He was adept at the technique that advanced yogis can use, that Master simply refers to in Autobiography of a Yogi but does not explain. Advanced yogis can work out karma on their physical bodies. And Swami just worked out a lot of karma for Ananda, for Master's work, and I believe for individual ones of us, by taking the strain onto his own body. I can't possibly explain how it's done except in the most abstract sense that, karma that is challenging for a person is a certain vibration of energy. And if you have enough magnetism, you can pull that energy away from the ego toward which it is being magnetized and pull it into himself and run the energy that way. So establishing the work in India required tremendous amount of cosmic energy. And so Swami was using his physical body in tapasya in order to make that happen, helping the people who were there. Now, that wasn't pleasant for Swamiji. I mean, it was a physical thing. He was in his physical body. He was capable, as he often demonstrated, of shifting his attention to a point where the reality of his physical body would not disturb him all that much. But nonetheless, he was there in his physical body. So it wasn't like it was pleasant to have his extremities swelling and his heart racing or very sluggish. I mean, none of those things were fun, or his rib broken, or his lungs corrupted by pneumonia. But there was joy in it because he knew that it was a means to an end. He intuitively knew that he was working that karma through him, and that karma going through him was going to free others from having to experience. He was taking karma for other people, so he was sparing them the inconvenience of that karma, freeing them to do other work, because he was strong enough to not be interrupted by it. But he knew that he was doing it for God, and he was very, very joyful, very joyful. He was stunningly joyful in those circumstances, which it came out so sweetly when that sadhu was there, because Swami didn't want the man to be unhappy. He wanted to actually give him darshan of joy. So when Swami was asked, how much discipline is enough? Well, that which you can do with joy, that which you can do without forgetting why you're doing it. And so that the transcendent benefit is more powerful in your mind than whatever small stages of deprivation you might feel. You know, whether you're adopting the practice of celibacy at a time in your life when it's not as effortless as it might be at other times, whether you're following a strict diet, whether you're, putting in particularly long hours of service, or, working hard to meditate deeply, depriving yourself in whatever ways are appropriate. It can never become in itself. You can never lose. You should never do more than you can do without remembering why you're doing it and being very happy that you're doing it. When I lived in my early years at Ananda for those first 10 years, we had very, very little money. But we were on that land, and it was beautiful land. We had no conveniences, no electricity, no running water, no anything. My little trailer was just tiny. It had a place where I could sit to meditate, a place where I could lie down to sleep, a place where I could stand and energize and cook a little food right there, and use I could boil hot water, and I took bucket baths for years. Eventually we had a shower house there, but I preferred the bucket bath. I could stand and do a bucket bath. I could sit down at a little table. That was my house. And it was wonderful. And I had a heater. I could not live without a heater. I wasn't capable of living without a heater. And I had a burner where I could heat up water and steam vegetables occasionally and make popcorn and the things that I did. No refrigeration. And I earned $50 a month, which was a little more than it is now, which Swami gave me in cash, which I kept in a little jar. I had no bank account because I never had enough money to need one, just a few dollars in that jar. I needed to buy food and propane. I mean, some people looked at that and thought that was tapasya. It just never crossed my mind that it was tapasya. I felt so free, just so wonderfully free. And above all, my life had meaning. And the fact that my life had meaning just completely transcended anything else. There was simply no other consideration. I was perfectly comfortable also. I've never been a very materialistically inclined person. I've never needed a lot of things. But nonetheless, it would be sort of surprising to me sometimes when people would sort of try to talk to me as if that was a tapasya, living in that little trailer just never having anything. And I was just sort of bepuzzled. Like, what could be hard about this? I didn't have a car, and I worked on the other side of the hill. I had good boots, a rain suit, a full rain suit, because it poured rain and it snowed. And in order to get from here to there was only one way to do it, which was to walk. I was in my 20s, so I had plenty of energy in that respect. Walking home late at night in a snowstorm. It was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. I mean, you wouldn't do it unless you had to, but being forced to do it, it was so wonderful. I just remember some of those with the flashlight in the snowstorm. It was just heavenly. And then even, we didn't have indoor plumbing, so we had an outhouse. I wrote about this in the Light Bearer book. So you would have to leave your house in the middle of the night at times when it might be raining or snowing, and you would never otherwise be outside. And as a consequence, you stepped into aspects of nature that you would have missed entirely. Gradually, as conditions improved, and I eventually, even at Ananda village, moved into this little house that had electricity and all of those things. Yes, of course, it was lovely, and I was very grateful to have it. And it was more expansive, and it was more appropriate for the stage of life I moved into. All of those things were true. But much was lost also, So there it is, that's what we're doing. So what all of that was about, rather than the enlightened, rather than condemning those who do not follow the path of enlightenment, should try to inspire them to prefer it. Because you see, that's the only way it works. Gandhi was once asked, I believe it was Mahatma Gandhi who said, you should never give up a pleasure until you have replaced it with a higher pleasure. And that again is also, it's not like you cannot make progress if you feel deprived by what you're doing. That's where the word joy comes in. You may know that you don't have what you want, but you don't feel deprived. You feel privileged. And the feeling of doing the right thing, knowing what you're building, you prefer to live that way. And then even your whole vibration begins to shift. And as your vibration shifts, it becomes that you can't even conceive of doing it differently. For when we were first here living in Palo Alto, in the first center one of the first centers that, after I moved here, that we established, was on a main street in Palo Alto, California Avenue, where it's just 2 blocks from where our temple is now. Now we have a freestanding, beautiful temple. Then we had a storefront. And it was upstairs, so it was a store back, actually, but it was in a retail building. And across the street from us, there was this old Quonset hut, which isn't there anymore, which had been converted into a nightclub. And I think it might have been an adult nightclub, but it was also a teenager's nightclub. Maybe it was only for teenagers, I'm not sure. And so sometimes after our classes or after our meditations, we'd come downstairs from our temple in the retail office, which was great location because it was way in the back. So nothing that was happening on the street ever touched us, upstairs in the back. So we'd come down the stairs and out onto the sidewalk, and we'd be then on the busy street and look across the street, and this nightclub would be going on over there. And sometimes the drum or the bass that was going on in that nightclub was so intense that you could actually feel it. It came like under the street, so you could feel it under the sidewalk of where you were standing. I can only imagine what it must have felt like inside that place. And one night, I lived not too far. We had a house that wasn't too far from where the storefront was. That was before we had the community. And I would often ride a bike on the summer nights. It was very safe. So I crossed the street and I went behind the nightclub heading for the road to my house. And there were a whole lot of people. It was like some kind of a special show. And there were all these teenagers, and they were waiting to get into the nightclub. And they were almost all dressed in black. I guess that was it wasn't a costume night. I guess it was just how they all dressed. I remember the periods of time when everybody wore black. So they're all in black, and they were kind of swarming is the only word I can use. They reminded me of ants swarming on an anthill. There was this crowd of people swarming on this anthill, all pushing to get into that nightclub. I thought to myself, inside that nightclub for me would be hell. It wouldn't be like I'd be trying to get in and pay money and hope that I could have a seat. I preferred not to go because of the experiences I've had, that's all. That kind of overstimulation of the senses and of the lower chakras and of the egoic self and the indulgent sensuality, it's just like, no, that is not a pleasure. I prefer. And I mean, it might be just as small as I prefer to stay home and meditate, than to go out raucously with my friends. I prefer quiet to noise. I prefer vegetarian food to a big steak. I remember being in a restaurant and the table next to us, they all were served these big steaks. Now, I'm not stupid, but I have lived a great deal of my life within a yogic ashram, and just for a moment, I didn't mind. I didn't judge them for eating steak. It was fine if they wanted to, but I was embarrassed for them. I was embarrassed that they were just eating it right out there in the public. But then, of course, I had to remind myself that it was fine. That's just what they do, and they like it. It was an up thing for them to have that big slab of dead cow on their plate, and they didn't think anything of it. But it would have choked me. Now, we can all look at our lives and see how we grow in refinement. And that which used to attract us, whether it's indulgent behavior, sensual behavior, unkind behavior, we all have done many things in the past that at the time we wanted to do. But then as we learned, we no longer want to. And that's how we have to train ourselves as devotees. And this is how we have to help each other as devotees. We have to awaken the enjoyment of higher realities. There was a woman friend of mine who was not very good at meditation and was sort of worried about herself because she meditated, but not that much and not that long. But I pointed out to her, I said, yes, it will be nice over time if you can gradually learn to meditate more. And I wasn't telling her that she didn't need to. But I pointed out to her that she loved the vibration of Ananda. And that was exactly true. She was in the temple as much as she could be in the temple. She loved the music. She loved the people. She loved to serve. She loved all of the ceremonies. She loved all of the events that we put on. Just the vibration of Ananda just made her so happy. And that whenever she had a choice, she would be in the vibration of Ananda. Now, eventually, by continually immersing herself in that vibration, she will expiate whatever the restless karma is that makes it hard for her to meditate, or the lack of discipline, or whatever it might be. But she can't bully herself into meditating, but she can do her best and then keep adding to her life everything that she enjoys that lifts her consciousness. That's why in Ananda we keep the doors wide open for people. I know this woman came up to me once after one of the services I'd given. She was relatively new. And she just basically, almost accusatorily, said to me, this reincarnation, she just couldn't believe it, and karma was just terrible, and she just didn't really like any of these teachings, and she thought they were all really stupid and like that. I don't know what she expected from me. I said, well, then by all means, just put them out of your mind. If it doesn't make sense to you, then forget it. I said, but you've been coming and you seem very happy here. She says, yes, I love the atmosphere. I love the music. I love the people. I said, great. So for the time being, at least, until it makes more sense to you, just forget the teachings. And I said, every time I start talking like that, you can put your hands over your ears. It'll be all right with me. I'll know what you're doing. Because if we can win people to prefer to be in tune with God than not to be in tune with God, then you never turn back. If you do it out of fear of God, if you do it out of expectation of reward, if you're making a deal with God, I'm going to do so much of this and then you're going to give me that, then we're always on tenuous ground. If we're following the spiritual path because it's the most fun thing we can think of to do, and it makes us happier than anything else, and the more we discipline ourselves to the teachings that Master has given us, the more joyful we feel in doing them. And that's where we need to be. There's one of Swami's songs. It's written for the oratorio of the life of Christ. And it's about Jesus drawing people to him. To souls that were fallen, he spoke of God's love and coaxed them with kindness to turn back again. Forsake, he said, the fulfillments of earth, for the comfort they give you lasts hardly an hour. He coaxed them with kindness. I mean, there's many times in Swami's written words, in his poetry of the lyrics of his songs, there'll be a phrase that just means so much to the heart. But coax them with kindness has always just stayed with me, because what we have to do is we have to not be afraid to draw close to God. Many times people are very afraid to draw close to God. They fear that they'll be exposed, that somehow if I open myself too much, he or she or it will see what I am and won't love me. There is that fear. There's also the fear that I will suffer, that nobody wants to go in a direction that you believe will hurt you more than it will comfort you. So one of my favorite words from the Bible too, Jesus, the way he talks about the feminine form, he mostly talked about God the Father. You don't find in the Bible him talking about God the Mother. It wasn't that the feminine didn't exist. It was that in the context of the times, when he was trying to draw people from the idea of God as the fierce judge, he could only draw them to the Father. But he put the feminine in there in truth by speaking of the Comforter. Now, I mean, what more perfectly describes the idea of Divine Mother than the Comforter? That's what the Mother is. You go to the Mother for comfort. When you're afraid, when you're unhappy, when you're disappointed, you go to the Mother for comfort. And Jesus said, I will send you the Comforter. And that's how we need to feel when we're being drawn to God. What we're being drawn to is we're being drawn to the infinite source of comfort. And so that's why Jesus himself, he coaxes them with kindness. Because we realize that everything that I'm trying to find, this security, this love, this adulation, this whatever it is, the sense of self-worth, what we're really asking for is that we be comforted. And kindness, understood, seen. And he coaxed us with kindness and invites us to turn back again. Forsake, he said, the fulfillments of earth, for the comfort they give you lasts hardly an hour. But the divine Comforter, that is the infinite power we're all seeking. God bless you.